Star Trek Discovery and its spin-off Star Trek Strange New Worlds are set in the Star Trek Prime timeline, the same as every other instance of Star Trek screen media, except for the trilogy of films set in the so-called Kelvin timeline. The first two seasons of Discovery and Strange New Worlds take place in the 2250s, while Star Trek the original series takes place in the 2260s, making those two series prequels to it. However, there is much dissent among Star Trek fans over whether all of these shows should be or even are set in the same timeline, since there are perceived discrepancies between the original series and its prequels. I wanted to examine this argument from both sides, as well as the various reasons people support each perspective. Apparently, some fans view Discovery and Strange New Worlds as being their own reality, simply because the characters are played by different actors than those who played them in the original series. Perhaps the movies, which are actually set in an alternate reality, put that idea into people's minds. Of all the reasons to view the prequel series in such a way, though, I think this one is the weakest. By that logic, or lack thereof, Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan and Star Trek III The Search for Spock, the latter picking up right where the former left off, would take place in two different realities because the role of Saavik had to be recast. Even in the TOS TV show, Captain Pike was played by two different actors. Jeffrey Hunter as he appears in The Cage and the flashback portions of The Menagerie, and Sean Kenny as the present-day disfigured Pike in The Menagerie. Leonard Nimoy's portrayal of Spock does appear in Star Trek Discovery when Michael Burnham views a holo recording of him from the 24th century. Now for the much bigger reason, the claims of continuity errors. Some of these are valid, while others could be explained or debunked entirely. Star Trek Discovery notably introduced its protagonist Michael Burnham as being Spock's adopted sister, but while that is a rather late-in-the-game addition to Spock's backstory 50 years after his debut, it doesn't in itself contradict canon. Spock has proven on multiple occasions that he does not like to discuss his family unless it is directly relevant to the situation, with examples being his fiancée, parents, and half-brother in that order. If Spock weren't so secretive, that would be another story. There's also the fact that in the first two episodes of Discovery, Michael commits and is convicted of mutiny, which is stated in TOS to have never occurred in Starfleet. At the end of Season 1, however, Michael's record is scrubbed, despite her mutiny having become widely known. It has also been argued that her actions only fit certain definitions of a mutiny. The finale of Discovery's second season also provides a very explicit reason why Spock does not discuss Michael in particular beyond that point in the timeline, because doing so would make him guilty of treason and risk her enormous sacrifice potentially becoming a waste. This also explains the spore drive never having been seen anywhere else in the timeline until the USS Discovery emerges in the 32nd century. The technology also becomes classified. It's the specific point in Spock's childhood when Michael becomes part of his family that makes things get tricky. Star Trek the Animated Series is a spin-off and direct sequel to Star Trek the original series. Those involved with Star Trek over the years have gone back and forth on whether the series is to be considered canon, but Gene Roddenberry himself considered one episode of it to be canon, Yesteryear. In this episode, Spock travels back in time to save the life of his 7-year-old self. Spock's birth year would be confirmed as 2230 by the 2016 movie Star Trek Beyond, meaning that the events of Yesteryear take place in 2237. However, a screen display in Season 1 of Discovery shows Michael's birth year as 2226, and a few episodes later she recalls her adoptive mother Amanda Grayson reminding her of a trip the two took on Michael's 10th birthday. This would make the year of her adoption as 2236, chronologically before the events of Yesteryear. Michael is therefore inexplicably absent from Yesteryear, aside from not having been written into canon yet. This has not been explained in Alpha canon thus far, but it is explained by Beta canon. In the autobiography of Mr. Spock, Spock clarifies that Michael was on an overnight field trip during the events of yesteryear, which makes sense to me, and so I accept it as canon. Star Trek's beta canon has long been a way of tying up loose ends left by its alpha counterpart. Now, discrepancies involving the exact years certain events happened are not new to Star Trek. The TOS episode Space Seed takes place in 2267, before Ensign Pavel Chekhov signed on to the Enterprise. However, Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan takes place in 2285, and Khan claims to have both been marooned by the Enterprise crew 15 years ago and seen Chekhov before. The incorrect number of years could be explained by Khan having no accurate way to tell the date, but unless he somehow crossed paths with Chekhov at some point, that part is simply a continuity error. Another thing from Season 1 of Star Trek Discovery pointed to as a retcon is Captain Lorca and the Discovery's crew using a battle simulation program, claiming that it was an example of a holodeck which wouldn't appear in Star Trek canon until series set in the next century. This is not a holodeck, though. We know from Star Trek Enterprise that holographic projection existed as far back as the 22nd century, and both the TOS episode, The Ultimate Computer, and Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan use battle simulations very similar to the one in Discovery. After all, such a simulation is how Starfleet Academy students take the Kobayashi Maru test. There was also what must have been a holodeck in the animated series episode The Practical Joker, if we're to count that as canon. There are a couple more events which seem contradictory to previously established canon, but I've come up with explanations for those. In the TOS episode Dagger of the Mind, Spock claims that he has never mind-melded with a human before. In the Strange New Worlds episodes Memento Mori and Charades, set before Dagger of the Mind, Spock uses a mind meld on his human crewmate La'an Noonien Singh and his human mother Amanda Grayson, respectively. The only way his statement in Dagger of the Mind could make sense is if he was knowingly lying or forgot that he had either of those melds. Consider this, though. The fact that Spock's meld with La'an caused her to learn something that she was never supposed to know, that being the existence of Michael Burnham as Spock's sister, which at that point was strictly classified. This could have made Spock hesitant to ever meld with another human who didn't also know about Michael, lest the same thing happen again, to the point where he would lie to get out of doing it. In addition to the practice of mind melding itself being very personal, the tradition during which Spock did so with his mother, as well as the memory that they shared, may also be viewed the same way. Another factor which may have made him hesitant enough to lie is that Dr. Van Gelder was a stranger to him while La'an was a close friend and his mother is family. Even besides that, Vulcans often don't tell the truth when it comes to personal matters, as would be later demonstrated in Amok Time, with Spock lying about the fact that he is going through Pon farr. In Discovery, Spock also claims to have mind-melded with and received visions of the future from the Red Angel, which turns out to be a human in a time travel suit, but there are ways that this can be explained too. Although Spock does eventually learn the true identity of the original Red Angel, that being Michael's biological mother, Dr. Gabrielle Burnham, he did not know that the Red Angel was human at the time he supposedly melded with her, and he may not have even learned that she was human at all through their interaction. It's even more likely that Spock wasn't truly mind-melding with Gabrielle, but rather seeing visions of the future through the suit's time crystal, with the suit itself acting as a conduit, so he did not have to touch the crystal directly to see the visions. After all, Vulcan mind melds require physical touch, and since the Angel never lowered her mask so that Spock could touch her as well as discover her true identity, it's entirely reasonable that the experience would not have have counted as a true mind meld. At the time Spock claims it was a mind meld, he did not know about the time crystal, so he would have no reason to assume that such a thing was the true source of his visions. Spock does claim that the thoughts he received from the angel were human, but since it was a human in the suit, he likely experienced the visions the way that a human would with the relevant emotions involved. Yet another possibility is that there are different types of mind melds. Spock's melds with La'an and Amanda merely allow the two of them to share memories with him, while his meld with Van Gelder seemingly merges their thoughts and personalities completely, with Spock speaking as if for both of them. In saying that he had never used a mind meld on a human, perhaps Spock simply meant the specific type of meld he would use on Van Gelder. One more thing that seems like an inconsistency is the TOS episode What Are Little Girls Made Of, having Nurse Chapel ask Spock if he's ever been engaged, when the Strange New Worlds episode Charades makes it so that she would know the answer. Even in the TOS episode, however, without any other context, Chapel asks the question in such a way that she doesn't seem to be expecting Spock to answer, and Spock looks surprised that she would ask him such a thing, period. Chapel's engagement to Roger Corby is different from Spock's engagement to T'Pring, since the latter was prearranged, and Spock did not feel any substantial continued attraction to T'Pring, nor desired to marry her like Chapel did with Corby. By reminding him of this, she would be pointing out to him that he doesn't and couldn't understand why she is reacting in such a way to the news of Roger being found alive. One may also perceive some bitterness between them from the fact that the two are exes, as established by the Strange New Worlds episode Subspace Rhapsody. In my opinion, the majority of Discovery and Strange New Worlds so far have an almost perfect track record of staying in line with the original series events. Strange New Worlds even features the moment when Kirk meets Pike upon Pike's promotion to fleet captain, which Kirk directly mentions in the TOS episode The Menagerie. Hopefully the hiccups regarding Spock's mind melds with La'an and Amanda can serve as a cautionary tale for the writers to be more careful in the future. Other than that, if the prequels were confirmed to be a separate continuity, it would completely nullify all the writers' efforts of keeping in line with the original series canon, which I think would be pretty disrespectful. There's one major issue with confirming that the original series and its prequels take place in separate timelines, the events of Star Trek Lower Decks. Lower Decks is obviously set in the same timeline as the original series and the animated series, as the events of both are directly alluded to and followed up on, but Lower Decks must also take place in the same timeline as Strange New Worlds, as two of its characters travel back in time directly into the time period in which Strange New Worlds is set, and they even meet the crew of the Enterprise at the time. The portal that Boimler and Mariner went through only took them back in time, not to a different timeline. When it comes to outright confirming or denying Discovery and Strange New Worlds as being a separate continuity from the original series, there's no way that everyone can be made happy. If it was confirmed, fans who criticize the prequel series for perceived continuity errors would be satisfied, but everyone who did see all the series as being the same timeline thus far would have to change their entire viewpoint. Not to mention the significant overhaul of Memory Alpha that would need to occur. A possible middle ground could be not confirming in canon that they're separate timelines, but rather suggesting it without direct confirmation. And the series finale of Star Trek Lower Decks does exactly that. In that episode, when a Klingon ship is hit by a wave of energy from an unstable rift leading to multiple other quantum universes, one of the Klingons is transformed into the alternate design that the Klingons were given in Star Trek Discovery. I thought that was pretty funny, but if taken seriously, it would actually kind of further complicate things. Given the nature of Lower Decks, though, I doubt this was meant to be taken so seriously and is instead just poking fun at how fans insist that certain things must be a separate timeline simply because they look different. In any case, I think the varying appearances of the Klingons can just be explained by variants within the species. We already knew that it was possible, albeit rare, for Klingons to be albino, and Discovery shows more examples of that phenomenon. As such, the way the Klingons look in Discovery is probably just another natural variation. Think of how much variation in physical traits the human race has in real life. When it comes to physical variations between members of the same species, it's sometimes explained in canon and sometimes not. Examples of species where it's not explained are the Trill, Caterians, and Boslik. Lower Decks, however, does explain the Orions from the animated series episode The Pirates of Orion having blue skin as opposed to green and calling themselves Orions instead of the typical pronunciation of the species and planet name, which must have been known to Starfleet by the time that episode takes place since the characters say the name like that too. The explanation is that they're still indigenous to the planet Orion and the same species, just a different physical appearance and culture. Even in green-skinned Orions, their skin is varying shades of green, and the blue Orions could be a subspecies like the Enar. There are probably a lot more different ways that they could imply without confirming that Discovery and Strange New Worlds are a separate universe from the original series. The main reason I think this is unlikely is how Trek seems to, for the most part, want to keep everything in the same continuity despite it not always making a lot of sense to do so. A prime example is the ending of the Discovery series finale going far out of its way to line up with the Short Trek's episode Calypso, which was almost certainly intended to be its own continuity at the time it was created. Even a mere implication is still pretty unlikely, and in either case, there would still be no explanation for Lower Decks incorporating the events of every Trek series, old and new. Here's the thing though, it has been part of Star Trek canon since the original series that multiple realities exist in which the same people, places, and things exist, yet different events have led to different outcomes. We see this in the Mirror Universe with the United Earth Empire, and in the TNG episode Parallels, where Worf keeps bouncing between various realities. The Star Trek Prodigy episode Cracked Mirror has a similar plot. Lower Decks' entire 5th season, which I alluded to earlier, also explores this concept extensively. Some of these realities feature events which fans would find ideal, such as the one where Trip Tucker and T'Pol were married for 63 years instead of Trip dying. The existence of these multiple realities could even be used to explain Data's cat Spot seemingly changing appearance and gender. So, for any scenario you could come up with, there's probably an existing timeline of the Star Trek universe where things happened that way. There's one where the events of every Star Trek series and movie happened, and different timelines where only some of them happened. Infinite diversity and infinite combinations of them. There really is no prime timeline, as shown by the fact that the inhabitants of every universe consider theirs to be the prime. Anytime we're engaging with any Star Trek media, we're free to imagine it as being in one of the realities where some canon event that we don't like didn't happen, where things are one particular way instead of another. With practically infinite alternate realities, everything is canon somewhere. I also think that Star Trek tie-in media, such as novels and video games, could be seen as being set in these varying timelines, since they're explicitly not under obligation to be congruent with the so-called main timeline of the TV series and movies. I'd also apply this to Star Trek fanfiction. Some people even see the show The Orville as an alternate reality of the Star Trek universe, and it very well could be. That said though, if Star Trek claims that all of its stories occur in the same continuity, I think it is just a wise writing choice to keep everything consistent when it makes sense to do so. Past editions of Star Trek have proven that it's possible, such as Star Trek Enterprise having an episode explaining why Klingons appear as they do in the original series. Countless fanfictions written to be canon compliant are also proof that it is doable, and the writers of some of the newer series such as Discovery have directly mentioned using Memory Alpha for reference. The issue of Star Trek's continuity is a complex one, characteristic of any such long-running franchise. We can argue about specifics until the spider cows come home, but it's not going to change anything. Even aside from the canon parallel universes aspect, I think the best thing to do is just let people interpret certain things as canon or not canon according to their own experience and perspective. In my ideal Star Trek timeline, everything would be canon except Generations, These Are the Voyages, the Romulan supernova and everything it entails, certain aspects of Star Trek Picard, and the Section 31 movie. In any case, what do you think? Do you agree with any of the points I've made in this video? Do you personally see Discovery and Strange New Worlds as a separate continuity from the original series? Do you see it as the same continuity, or are you conflicted about it? Which parts of canon would be included or not included in your ideal Star Trek timeline? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching this video. I've got more on Star Trek and plenty of other media for you to check out if you want. Live long and prosper, and I'll see you next time.